Hi Suman. Hi Saundri.
Hi, Divya.
So nice to
Hi,
see you
Divya.
here.
Yeah, lovely to connect with you. I was just telling Suman that Balraman was proudly mentioning about my niece is with Mentza. So
Yeah,
it's like,
absolutely. Yeah, that's so cool. He said, "What a small world it is." Saundri,
totally lovely to connect with
like
you.
that.
Yeah, really small world. And Divya, I've been doing these sessions with her. Suddenly they've become very busy. Congratulations, Divya, on getting covered by your store as
Thank you,
well.
Suman. Thanks so much. Do you want to get started, Suman?
Yeah,
Should we
yeah,
set a
let's
little
get
bit of
started.
context? Yes, excellent.
Sure, sure. So let me also introduce for our viewers, for our listeners, rather, I would say. So I'm happy to have with us today Saundari Mukherjee, who will join us to speak on taking ownership. So that's the topic for today. So she's a lot of things. She's an organizational consultant, she's a coach, she's a powerful storyteller, she's a faculty, the list goes on. We share a common passion, which is to be more human at work. Okay, so thanks, Andri, for joining.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be on Mensa and with you, Suman and Divya.
Oh, absolutely. I'm also very excited. So let's jump right in. So we're going to talk about taking ownership, right? So the first thing that comes to mind is ownership is a mindset. Job descriptions have responsibility. Earlier days we used to have job descriptions. Nowadays what's happening is the JDs are getting hazy. For instance, if there's a startup, there's no JD per se. Now JD typically lists the responsibilities very clearly, but it never lists what is ownership, because that's more mindset. So responsibility is given, whereas ownership is taken, and that's why it's more mindset. When people have an ownership mindset, they take responsibility for the outcomes, not just the output. It's interesting when we do workshops to uncover the top behaviors, yeah, that's going to make them successful going forward, which we do as part of the culture thing. Taking ownership often shows up in the list, right? Quite often, but maybe more than 50% of the time, it will be there in the top three. Now, interestingly, one of the reasons why it shows up is not only people feel it's important, they also feel it's lacking, right? And isn't that true? Ask any business owner, and they really wish their people took ownership, and they wish that they thought more like owners.
So I think, Suman, it's such a lovely point that you bring up, right? And in the circle, you talked about the context of VUCA also, right? And I think it's increasingly very, very important because a lot of big companies are moving, even Menza, right, to trust-based, and honor-based kind of systems, right, where we work complete transparency, and we expect employees, etc., to do the same. And I
Right.
think it really works well when and it's such a moment of pride when we see people at Menza take up ownership and discuss it like it's their own baby or it's their own problem that they're trying to solve, right? And not just kind of what's expected out of them. I am more interested to learn about when you said that a lot of people feel that it is lacking. That's
Yeah.
something I'd love to listen to a little bit more about. But maybe we should start off with why, right? Why does ownership play such an important role in today's context? And is it different from before, right? Is it more important?
Great question. Saundra, you want to address that?
Yeah, would love to. And Divya, I just want to build on what you said about Mensa and, the people who are taking ownership. So I just want everybody to just imagine this. Have you ever worked with someone who had that magical effect on your team? Someone who, irrespective of where they are in the organizational hierarchy, so to say, continues to find a way to move things forward for the team. And you come out interacting with that person saying, hey, I want to be that person, right? So I call these people culture builders. They make it personal, they take action, they become the change. And let me share a quick example, and I'm sure you'll think of some people like that automatically. So this is Samit Sani. In 2017, he was working as a security guard at London's Heathrow Airport. The kind of person who says laptops out, iPads out in the plastic trays and all that. He was on a low wage scale. His family was struggling to make ends meet. He was sharing his house with his mother, 2 children, wife, and all that. And regardless of this, he was passionate about his work. He noticed that there were inefficiencies in the way the airport operated. He saw this YouTube video about Power Apps, which is the Microsoft product. And he started exploring a little bit and said, how can I make more processes digital? And one of the processes that he was responsible for was when an item gets confiscated, they would have to write the name and description of the item in a bit of paper, and they would staple it to the bag and they would send it for storage. Now, the problem was that the paper could get lost, or if it goes out in the rain, the ink would run. So it was highly inefficient and very paper based. So he tried to map it to digital using Power Apps. Now, at the next team meeting, he goes and tells his boss of all the work that he's been doing. The boss thinks it's incredible. And he says, you know what, Samit, just take a month off from the security team, out of the checking baggages piece, and go around all around the terminals and see what you can improve from right across the security teams. And then as he's doing it, he gets his call from the airport's IT department back at the headquarters. And he's thinking, oh my God, what have I done wrong? Have I broken something? And the headquarter ID guy says, Samit, we've heard what you've done. It's incredible. We'd like you to take a secondment to the IT team. And he now runs a team developing Power Apps for the airport. And
Wow.
this was not it. The magic for him was he got a call from Satya Nadella saying, you know, Samit, you're doing such a great job. I want you to present on stage with me at our Inspire conference at Las Vegas. So as Samit says, I don't want to just make a living. I want to make a difference. And for me, that is ownership in action.
I think that's brilliantly said. Making a living to making a difference. So Divya, so you know why, when I'm looking for inspirational stories, why she's my go-to person.
Absolutely. I can see that. Saundari is so nice.
Great.
So Suman, how do you, when you work with people, you work a lot on culture and teams and all that. How do you make people get it?
So, what I try to do is first try to kind of simplify it or break it down to something which is tangible, which is actionable. So in order to make something like ownership actionable, let's think of scenarios where ownership comes up, right? So let's say there's a new project. Often what will happen is somebody will say, this is not my job as per the JD. Yeah, that's a very siloed approach. So you don't want somebody who has ownership. You don't want that person to say, this is not my job, right? Especially today in a VUCA world. If it's an existing project, let's say there are a whole bunch of things. What typically happens in large companies, a whole bunch of initiatives running, but something is not moving. And no one is taking initiative. Someone takes the initiative. They start owning it. They make it personal, then they move it. So instead of saying, this is not my job, they're like saying, this is my job, even though nobody has told them to say it, right? It could be even for an existing project to hold each other accountable. We hear this word very often, right? Making sure each of us are doing what we are supposed to do. That's what great teams are all about. And I think that involves other facets. For instance, speaking up, it requires courage. It also requires a certain amount of tact and finesse to hold each other accountable. And when the project ends, if some issues come up, you get criticism, then are we owning the outcome or are we just blaming somebody else? To me, that is also ownership. Yeah. So all of these things we need to take care of when we are saying, when we're talking of taking ownership. Now, linking it to the last point which I mentioned, how to make it happen. I think the first thing, which is very nice way of doing it, is to think like an owner. What would the owner think? What the owner feel? What they would do? So I've been recently consulting for a startup, and the owner, and often in these meetings, the owner would be sitting there, and she would ask her team members, saying that, "Hey, what do you think that makes me feel?" Let's say something has happened. They'll say, "Hey, what do you think that makes me feel?" And suddenly people are kind of thinking from her perspective, right? So this is great perspective shifting. So that could be a first thing which is very useful. The other is what I call the difference between a product mindset as opposed to a project mindset. Often we come with a project mindset, right? There's a ship date, supposed to send out something. After that is done, you walk away, and that's the end of it. Whereas with the product, it is more outcome focused. And in order to do that, I think as leaders, we need to share information openly so that people know the strategy, they know the plans, they know what mistakes the company has done, right? All of that, which helps them to work better. It sounds very simplistic, but I think it's amazing how disconnected often companies are in terms of just information flow, right? The guy at the lower levels has no idea about what the guys at the top are trying to do, right? So I think information sharing becomes very important in order to take ownership. And deciders and the people who are deciding are often very cut off, are often, many layers away from the people who are implementing. And I think if ownership really has to happen in a company, the deciders and implementers need to be closer. Now, how do you do that? In a large company, there are many levels separating the two because only the senior guys sitting at the top are taking the big decisions, whereas the guys on the ground are many levels far removed, right? So one way is to look at it is maybe do small teams. In fact, if you see some of these big companies today, the ones which are doing really well, let's take Apple as an example, they work with small teams. I think what that helps is it gives end-to-end accountability and also they're customer focused. Yeah. Of course, there'll be hierarchy in a large team, but in small teams, at least you are involved in the decision, or if something happens, at least you can talk to a manager, right? As opposed to, many levels and you have no idea who the guy who's deciding at the top versus where you are sitting. Okay. So I have a few more points I can think of, but maybe let me just turn to Saundari. So Saundari, since you do a lot of powerful storytelling, maybe you can share with us how can storytelling help to build ownership?
No, absolutely. So many thought streams are coming as you're speaking, Suman. And I'm just thinking about, one thing on how do you create that disconnect, stop the disconnect with the information flow part of it. And again, that's where storytelling can also come in. But I'm thinking about Unilever, when they had all these folks in the factory workers who were making the labels, packaging labels. So they were just churning out packaging labels like a flow. That's all they were doing. And they were making the packaging labels for Lifebuoy. What they did is they took this entire team and took them to a village where this mother washing her hand before she made food with Lifebuoy, she would wash her hand and then she would go into the food preparation. And they tracked the efficacy of how it really helped children stay healthy as a result. So they tracked that. So they took these factory workers, took them to these villages where the soap was being used and where it was making an impact on child mortality. And then when they started going back to packaging their labels, they totally, were thinking big picture and purpose. They weren't feeling disconnected. They weren't just a peg in the wheel, kind of a thing. So I think sharing some of these examples and, if you think about it, Suman and Divya, like storytelling is the oldest form of culture building that there is to it. It is through stories that all important cultural information gets fed. So when you talk about stories about people who work with you, they inspire us and they challenge us to be better. Knowing that such and such a thing is happening in Mentza and people are behaving like this makes me think, oh, I want to be that person, right? It creates that positive feedback loop. So as important as storytelling is, it's equally important to collect these stories from ground level and share the stories so that those stories become a trigger for action for others. And that's where storytelling really plays a very important part because it's easier to tell positive culture building stories than policing people into culture building. And I mean, culture add instead of fit in this context.
Right. No, that's a very powerful story. In fact, what I find amazing about stories is also you remember them, right? You remember them vividly. So one story that's coming to my mind, like the Unilever example, is I believe Mercedes. They realized the people who were in their showrooms were not taking the kind of pride in Mercedes as a brand, right? They were just treating it like a normal job. So they were not energized themselves, so they were not energizing the people who were walking in. So they did a lot of whole bunch of training interventions, nothing worked. And then somebody had an idea. They said, hey, each of you can decide whatever model you want, and you can go and drive this Mercedes car and keep it with yourself for a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
and that's all they did. And they realized that people on the road, if they had a fancy car, people would turn their heads and look at them, and they felt good about it. And that's how they increased ownership. And I thought that was, again, a great example of how you do things by actually making them do it rather than just telling them.
Right. The show versus tell, for sure.
Correct.
And Saudari, you were talking about stories and culture building, right? It's also the right kind of stories, and so lots of organizations, there's multiple stories that get told. Sometimes it's the wrong stories that kind of get word of mouth just because they're the wrong kind of stories, right? And influence culture. I think I know this might be a little apart from the topic, but I would love to know how. You would also, in both your expertise and experience, Suman and Saundari, how do you curate the right kind of stories that are being told in an organization, and how do you make an example of the right kind of stories, right? Even with the ownership one,
Yeah.
making sure that that feedback was great, right, is one way to make sure that story delights, rather than just it being about somebody who took initiative and who solved the problem. The Satya Nadella part of it, which was look at the outcome that went way beyond what anyone would have expected, made it a great story to tell, right? So how do you, if you get my question, how do you curate the right story?
Right. I think one is by just telling a lot of stories. I do believe that sometimes we try to finesse the stories and then don't share stories enough. You have to collect and you have to share a lot of stories, and you have to just practice telling them, sharing them, and that creates a muscle. There was this very interesting study done on this about pottery, making pottery. That's one more of my passions, but a really quick one on that. So they had two teams working with a teacher, and one team was going to be assessed on the quality, what that one perfect pot that they were producing, and the other team was going to be assessed on just the quantity, the volume of pots that they produced. And without going into the details, just a quick version of it is, just take a guess which is the team which made actually the best pot. Do you want to take a guess, Suman?
Well, I think I know this one. And it's counterintuitive. It's the one which made more pots.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is how stories also are in some ways. You just need to collect a lot of them, try telling them, see what is the audience response, see what is resonating, connecting, and keep refining. And to that extent, equally about ownership, lack of ownership stories are also important to share. It's like sharing to failure stories to promote innovation. It's the equivalent of that. You need to know what not to do and what to do both ways. So really not being filtering the stories initially, not putting that black hat on, but collecting as much as possible.
Great. Maybe I'll just add to that, to the question of how do you curate. I think that if the stories are closer to where what you are doing, it resonates even more. So maybe I'll just share this small example. So we do quite a bit of work on culture building. So one of the companies said, hey, you know what? We don't need to know the top behaviors. We already have that. It's all on the wall. It's a pretty large company. I said, then what's the issue? They said, the issue is that people don't get it, right? It's out on the wall, but it's not, people don't know it or they don't get it. So what we decided to do is to cull out stories from within the organization. And it was a new work for me as well. And the problem statement was very interesting. They said, hey, you know what? My CEO has just come from a different company. And in a town hall, he's talking about stories from his previous company because he doesn't have much idea about the stories in his own company, right? Because nobody has kind of told him those stories. So what we did as an initiative is we went in there and we spoke to a whole bunch of people in the organization at different levels. And it was amazing what kind of stories they had to tell. Real stories, right? Of, let's say, how they cracked a deal, how they went to a customer, how the customer didn't want to meet them, how the guy was to go and probably, build relationship with the watchman, and on this fourth attempt somehow got in. All kinds of interesting stories. The point is, all of those were actually values in action, right?
Right.
And then what happens is you link it to the company values and they become real, they become live. So let's say one value is agility. So instead of trying to explain what agility is, you say, hey, look at the story what Suresh did on our Chennai office. And it's right there and it's your own story. So I think stories can be very powerful, and the closer it is to what you're doing, to the company or to the organization, even better. So that could be one way of curating.
No, lovely. I mean, absolutely. Internal stories really connect because you're creating that thing is, I want to be like that person, right? You're creating that crave-worthy moment there. So that also builds behavior. Very.
Absolutely. So Divya, are there any questions or perspectives others would like to share?
No, I'm just digesting all of this. This is great, right, Suman? Could we? And I know, Soundari, you started off with an example in the beginning. Could you, share any other when you talk about storytelling, when you talk about stories of ownership? What might those look like, right? I get initiative, I get taking problem solving approach, mindset, and all of those, but what would some more examples of ownership look like, and some of the most surprising ones rather than exemplary ones? You know what I mean? If you have some.
No, sure, sure. I really like this one because it is somebody that is pretty well known in India. This is about E. Sridharan, the person who was in charge of getting a lot of the work around the I was going to say MTR, which is what it is here in Hong Kong, but the Konkan Railways and the Delhi Metro and all that. So this happened in 1964. So a cyclone hit the coast of southern India and it absolutely destroyed Pamban Bridge, which connects Rameshwaram to the mainland. And Sridharan at that time was a young engineer who was assigned to the project. He was just, handling the local licensing and the contact part of it. He was given 3 months to do the construction of the bridge. But the cyclone hit, and because of that, all the girders, the steel beams, and the things which are used for building the bridge and the large frame, 126 of them just fell into the sea. And no one knew how long it will take to manufacture new ones. Maybe it'll take months. Nobody knew. So this young engineer, because he was a local liaison and he had spent his time talking to all the local fishermen, he decided to take their help, and the fishermen actually went to the bed of the sea and slowly they used cranes to lift up all the existing girders itself. And they finished this entire task in just 43 days. And at that time, the railway minister called him and gave him a big 1,000 rupee award, which was like big money at that time. We're talking about the 60s. So the whole thing is that a lot of this is, we are talking today about going local and speed and all that. But how do you really look at using something that you have already instead of waiting for something new or waiting for head office to take action or waiting for that magic wand to come from somewhere? So that's also part of that whole ownership piece. And this is for every day, for small things that you can do. You don't need to wait for somebody else to initiate it. And Suman set this up nicely saying, not my job, which is, when something starts, it's not my job. Okay, he could have just escalated it and sat back, but he didn't. And I think that's where the difference comes in your day-to-day work.
Absolutely. And it's not even that it's his job. It's nowhere is it written that he is supposed to do that, right? It's just that he's taking initiative and thinking like an owner.
Absolutely.
A lot of our listeners are, they even know who you're talking about, Soundari. So you should see the comments in the chat. I think this is amazing. I love your examples. And if you had to sum up, Suman, about what ownership look like, do you want to do that? You have 40 seconds.
Yeah, we have 40 seconds. So Saundari, maybe you can go and then I can.
No, go for it, Suman. All yours, your platform.
So I think ownership is very, very important. And I think that maybe we'll do this in another part. Just 20 seconds left. I think there's a little more to talk about in terms of some of the strategies one can use, and some could be very powerful as well. So maybe we'll use the same platform and the same structure and do a second part next week.
Yes, that would be amazing. There are still some questions that I have. That would be excellent. Thank you so much.
Super.
Thank you.
Thanks, Soundari. So lovely to see you here. Welcome to Mentza.